Imagine opening your Bible tonight and discovering that its most shocking truth has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. It isn't locked in the Vatican, buried under Egyptian sands, or hidden in some secret vault. It is right there, in the pages people have been reading for millennia. But what if everything you were taught about God, angels, and the spiritual world was only half the story? What if the Bible is describing a reality far stranger, far more complex than any of us ever imagined? Consider this. Why does the Bible repeatedly describe heavenly assemblies? Why does the book of Job show divine beings presenting themselves before God? And why does Psalm 82 explicitly say that God stands among the gods to judge them? Most people skip these verses or look away when the questions get uncomfortable, but tonight we are refusing to look away. We are opening a book that forced theologians and pastors to confront the reality of an unseen realm operating beyond human sight. Tonight, we open a book that forced thousands of scholars to revisit assumptions they carried for their entire careers. It is The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. Why does Psalm 82 say God stands among the gods and judges them? Who are these divine beings sitting in assembly with the Most High? Most people skip these verses, but tonight we are going to look closer. We are moving beyond the visible world and into an ancient documented reality that mainstream religion has long ignored. We are moving beyond the surface of religion, mythology, and history to uncover a hidden framework that ancient sages, philosophers, and mystery schools believed governed reality itself. By the end of this video, you will see the world, the spiritual realm, and your own life through a lens that few people ever acquire. You will discover why the ancients encoded their wisdom in symbols, why the same patterns appear across civilizations, and why humanity has spent thousands of years searching for a truth that may have been hidden in plain sight. This is not merely a journey through an old book. It is a journey into the architecture of creation itself. So dim the lights. Leave your assumptions at the door and stay with me, because what you are about to hear has been waiting thousands of years to reach you. Part 1. The Hidden Government of Heaven. What is the Divine Council? What if the universe is not governed the way you think? What if, right now, beyond the reach of human eyes, there exists a structured government, a council of divine beings that has been shaping the fate of nations, civilizations, and individual lives since the very beginning of time? This is not science fiction. This is not mythology. This is what the ancient texts have been saying all along, and most of us were never told. The word council might make you think of politicians in a boardroom, but the Divine Council is something far older, far more powerful, and far more dangerous. In the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Canaan to Israel, every major civilization believed that the universe was administered by a structured assembly of divine beings presided over by a supreme deity. And the Bible, astonishingly, agrees. Here is what shocks most people when they first encounter this. The Bible was never written to a modern Western audience that believed in one God ruling a silent, empty heaven. It was written to people who lived in a world full of gods, or at least beings that acted like gods. And the biblical authors did not deny this reality. They used it. They wrote into it. They assumed their readers already knew about the council. So what exactly is the Divine Council? Scholar Michael Heiser defines it clearly. The Divine Council is the assembly of supernatural beings who serve under the authority of the Most High God. These beings are not equal to God, but they are real. They have power, they have roles, and they have the ability to choose, which means they have the ability to rebel. And as we will discover, Some of them did exactly that. Now here is your first life lesson, and it comes faster than you expect. Most people live their entire lives believing they are fighting against flesh and blood enemies, your difficult boss, your toxic relationship, your financial struggle. But what if the ancient texts are right? What if some of the resistance you face in life is connected to something operating at a level far above the human? That shift in perspective changes everything about how you respond. Think about the most successful spiritual and philosophical leaders in history, from Marcus Aurelius to Viktor Frankl to modern Stoics. They all understood one thing: the battle is never just external. There are systems, structures, and forces at work beyond what the eye can see. The Divine Council framework gives you a cosmic map for understanding why the world feels the way it does, and why some struggles seem too big, too coordinated, to be purely human in origin. But who are these council members? We will explore each of them in detail throughout this series. In part 2, we will meet the sons of God, the beings who stood directly before the throne of the Most High. In part 4, we will examine the Watchers, council members who abandoned their posts and committed an act so catastrophic it literally reshaped human history. But right now, let us understand the structure itself. The Divine Council operates in tiers. At the top, the Most High God, whom Heiser identifies with the God of Israel, El Elyon in the ancient texts. Below him, a tier of powerful divine beings called the Sons of God, or Bene Elohim in Hebrew, beings with authority over nations, over natural forces, over spiritual territories. And below them, lesser spiritual beings, messengers, watchers, servants, a complete hierarchy, a real government. Here is what makes this staggering. This is not just one verse, one passage, or one obscure text. The evidence is woven throughout the entire Bible. Psalm 89:5-7 says, "The heavens praise God in the assembly of the holy ones." Job 1 and 2 describe a scene where the sons of God present themselves before God, and Satan is among them with a specific role. 1 Kings 22 shows God consulting a heavenly assembly before sending a spirit to deceive a king. And here is your practical task for this part. A simple but profound shift you can begin today. For the next 7 days, whenever you face a situation that feels overwhelming, unjust, or impossibly difficult, ask yourself this question: is this battle purely human, or is something larger operating here? You do not need to have all the answers. Just training your mind to think at a higher level of reality changes your response, your peace, and your strategy. Successful people, whether they call it spiritual warfare, systems thinking, or cosmic awareness, all operate from the same principle. They do not just react to the surface. They ask what is driving the surface. The Divine Council framework, as Heiser presents it, is the most ancient version of this kind of thinking. It is the original systems map of reality. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So here is the question I want you to sit with before part 2 begins, and it is a question that has haunted theologians, philosophers, and scholars for centuries. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why would he create a council of beings with the power to rebel? Why give divine beings freedom? And what happens when that freedom is used to corrupt an entire civilization? The answer begins in part 2. And it will change the way you read every ancient text forever.
The future we are sworn to protect.
Part 2. Sons of God, the beings who stood before the throne. In part 1, we established that the Divine Council exists, a structured heavenly government operating beneath the Most High God. But now comes the question that changes everything. Who are the members of this council? Who are these beings powerful enough to stand in the presence of God, receive divine assignments, and govern entire nations? The ancient texts have a very specific answer, and it is far more shocking than anything your Sunday school ever taught you. The Hebrew term is Bene Elohim, literally, sons of God. And before you assume this is just a poetic phrase for angels, stop. Because Michael Heiser, with decades of peer-reviewed scholarship behind him, makes something crystal clear. The sons of God in the ancient biblical world were not angels in the way modern Christianity defines them. They were a distinct category of divine beings, created directly by God, possessing real power, real personality, and real choice. Where do we find them? Everywhere, once you know what to look for. In Genesis 6:1-4, the sons of God see the daughters of men and take them as wives. In Job 1:6, the sons of God present themselves before God, and Satan is counted among them. In Psalm 29:1, they are called to worship. In Psalm 89:6-7, they surround God in a great assembly. These are not metaphors. These are descriptions of real beings with real presence in a real heavenly court. Now here is what most people never stop to consider. Why does this matter for your life today? Because if the sons of God are real beings with authority over nations and territories, then the chaos you see in the world, the corruption of governments, the cycles of war, the spiritual darkness that grips entire regions, has an explanation that goes beyond human greed or political failure. Some of it is being driven from a level you cannot see with human eyes. Think about that for a moment. You watch the news and you see the same patterns repeating. Different countries, different centuries, same darkness. Heiser's framework gives you the ancient explanation. Certain territories have been under the influence of rebellious divine beings since the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. We will go deep into that in part 7. But right now, understand this. The sons of God were assigned to govern, and some chose to corrupt instead. Here is your practical life application for this section. Every great strategist, from Sun Tzu to modern CEOs, understands that you cannot solve a problem if you are only looking at the surface level. The Sons of God framework teaches you to ask a deeper question when you face systemic failure. Who or what benefits from this chaos, not just humanly, but structurally? Train yourself to look for the system behind the system. That is ancient wisdom made practical. But here is where it gets even more extraordinary. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in the caves of Qumran, contain a version of Deuteronomy 32:8 that changes everything. The Standard Bible you own says God divided the nations according to the number of the children of Israel, but the Dead Sea Scrolls say, according to the number of the sons of God. This is not a translation error. This is a deliberate ancient truth that was altered, and Heiser proves it. That one verse, Deuteronomy 32:8, is the backbone of the entire divine council theology. It means God literally assigned the nations of the world to divine beings as their territories. Each son of God received a nation to govern. And what happened next? How some of them ruled well and others descended into corruption and demanded worship for themselves is the story that runs beneath all of human history. We will explore this fully in part 7. Stay with us until then. Now here is something that will hit differently when you understand it. Every ancient civilization, Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Rome, had a pantheon of gods. Mainstream scholarship calls these mythology. But Heiser asks a radical question. What if these ancient peoples were not inventing gods? What if they were remembering real divine beings who had been assigned to their nations, beings who then demanded worship and presented themselves as supreme? The evidence is staggering. This changes how you see the world's religions and cultures. When you read about Zeus, Marduk, or Ra, you're not reading pure fantasy. You may be reading corrupted memories of real divine assignments gone wrong. and that is a perspective shift that the greatest comparative mythologists, from Joseph Campbell to Jordan Peterson, have circled around without ever fully naming. Heiser names it directly with textual evidence. The sons of God became the gods of the nations. Your task for this section, for the next week when you encounter a cultural belief system, a religious tradition, or even a political ideology that seems to have a godlike hold over people, observe it through this lens. Ask yourself, is this purely human devotion, or does this look like something designed to capture worship and redirect it away from the Most High? You do not need to judge it. Just observe. That awareness alone is a form of ancient wisdom very few people carry. And now, the question that will keep you awake tonight. If the sons of God were given authority over the nations, and some of them chose rebellion and corruption, what exactly did they do? How bad did it get? And why did God allow it to escalate to the point where an entire civilization had to be wiped from the earth? The answer involves a mountain, a forbidden act, and a crime so catastrophic it echoes through every ancient text ever written. That answer begins in Part 3. Part 3, Psalm 82, the verse that destroys everything you were taught. There is a single verse in the Bible that mainstream Christianity has been quietly avoiding for centuries, not because it is unclear, not because it is poorly translated, but because if you read it plainly, exactly as it is written, it collapses the entire framework of modern religious thinking and replaces it with something far older, far stranger, and far more magnificent. That verse is Psalm 82 verse 1. And today we are going to read it together without flinching. God stands in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. That is what it says, not metaphorically, not poetically. The Hebrew word used here is Elohim, the same word used for the God of Israel throughout the entire Old Testament, and it appears twice in that one verse, once for the Most High and once for the beings he is judging. The biblical author is telling you plainly, there is an assembly, there are multiple Elohim, and God is presiding over them in judgment. Now, before your mind jumps to, but the Bible teaches monotheism, Heiser addresses this directly, and his answer is brilliant. He does not say the Bible teaches polytheism. He says the Bible teaches something scholars call monolatry, or more precisely, cosmic monotheism, one supreme God, uniquely uncreated above all others, with a council of created divine beings beneath him. This is not paganism. This is the original architecture of biblical cosmology, hidden in plain sight. What does God accuse these divine beings of in Psalm 82? Read verses 2 through 4. He says they have judged unjustly, they have shown partiality to the wicked, they have failed to defend the poor, the fatherless, the afflicted. They were given authority over the nations, and they used that authority to corrupt rather than to protect. This is not a metaphor for bad human judges. This is a divine courtroom, and the defendants are supernatural beings who failed their cosmic assignment. Here is where your life application begins, and it is powerful. The greatest leaders throughout history, from Abraham Lincoln to Nelson Mandela, understood that authority is not given for self-advancement. It is given for service. When authority is used to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, it becomes corrupt, whether that authority is human or divine. Psalm 82 is the oldest recorded indictment of corrupt governance in human history, and it is as relevant today as the day it was written. Ask yourself this question honestly. Where in your life have you been given authority, and are you using it the way God intended? As a parent, a manager, a teacher, a leader in any capacity, authority is a divine assignment. The beings in Psalm 82 failed because they prioritized power over purpose. Every week, audit your own use of authority. Write down one way you protected someone vulnerable using the position or influence you carry. That is what the council was supposed to do. Now verse 6 hits like thunder. God says to these divine beings, "I have said you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High." He is acknowledging their divine status. He gave them that title. He gave them that position. And then comes verse 7, the sentence that changes everything. "Nevertheless, you will die like men. You will fall like any prince." Wait, can divine beings die? The answer unlocks one of the deepest mysteries in all of ancient theology. Yes, according to Heiser's reading, these divine beings are not immortal in the way God is immortal. Their existence can be terminated as divine judgment. They were given a status, a role, an authority, and that authority came with accountability. When they corrupted their assignment, God pronounced a death sentence over them. This is extraordinary because it tells us the universe operates on moral accountability at every level. Not just the human level. Justice reaches into heaven itself. This is the perspective shift that will change how you see injustice. When you look at the world and ask, why does evil seem to win? Psalm 82 gives you the ancient answer. The corrupt governors of the nations, both human and divine, are under a sentence that has already been declared. The judgment is coming. It is not that God is absent or indifferent. It is that the courtroom has already ruled, and the execution of that sentence is unfolding through history, exactly on schedule. Highly effective people, those who maintain inner peace in the face of injustice, share one trait. They operate from a deep conviction that the universe is morally structured. They do not need to see immediate justice to trust that justice is real. Psalm 82 gives you the ancient cosmic framework for that conviction. The corrupt will not govern forever. The sentence has been declared. Your job is not to despair at injustice. It is to keep doing what the council failed to do. And now Jesus enters this picture in the most unexpected way. In John 10:34, when the religious leaders accused Jesus of blasphemy for calling himself the Son of God, he quotes Psalm 82:6 directly. He says, "Is it not written in your law, I said you are gods?" Why does Jesus quote this verse in his own defense? What is he claiming? What does it mean that he connects his own identity to the divine council passage? This question takes us deep into part 9. Do not miss it. Before part 4, drop a comment with part 3, Psalm 82, and tell me, does it change how you see injustice in the world, knowing that a divine courtroom has already declared judgment over corrupt authority? Share this with someone who needs to hear that justice is not dead. It just operates on a timeline beyond human sight. And if this series is opening something in you, like this video so more people can find what you just found. But here is the question that will pull you straight into part 4. And I promise you, the answer is darker and more astonishing than anything we have covered so far. If God judged the sons of God in Psalm 82 for corrupting the nations through unjust governance, what exactly did the worst of them do before that judgment? What was the original crime that made God look down at the earth and decide that something had gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong? That story begins at a mountain. Part 4. The Watchers, council members who chose rebellion. Every kingdom has guardians. Every government has trusted officials. But what happens when the very beings assigned to protect a system become the greatest threat to it? According to the Divine Council worldview, that is exactly what happened. Among the members of God's heavenly administration existed a group known as the Watchers. Their purpose was simple: observe humanity, guide the nations, and remain faithful to the authority that appointed them. But they chose something else, and the consequences would reshape human history forever. Who were these Watchers? Were they symbolic figures or actual supernatural beings? To answer that, we have to open one of the most controversial texts in biblical history, the Book of Enoch. Found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and quoted in the New Testament itself, Enoch was treated as authoritative by many early believers. Yet later, religious institutions pushed it aside. Why? Because what it says about the spiritual world raises questions that many authorities were uncomfortable answering. According to 1 Enoch and Genesis 6, 200 watchers looked upon humanity and made a decision that violated the very purpose of their existence. Led by a figure called Semyaza, they descended to Mount Hermon and crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. But here's the real question. Was their rebellion driven by love, curiosity, or something darker? The text is clear. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of defiance against divine order. Why should an event thousands of years old matter to you today? Because the Watchers' failure was not merely supernatural. It was deeply human. They abandoned responsibility for desire. They traded purpose for impulse. Sound familiar? How many people destroy years of progress for a moment of temptation? How many sacrifice a calling for a distraction? The story survives because it reflects a pattern that repeats itself in every generation, including ours. And this is where the lesson becomes personal. Every person has an assignment, a responsibility, a path they are uniquely positioned to walk. The real battle is not discovering that calling. The real battle is protecting it. The greatest athletes, artists, entrepreneurs, and leaders often describe success in the same way, learning to say no to the temptations that slowly pull them away from their purpose. The Watchers failed that test. Humanity still struggles with it today, but their rebellion did not stop there. Something even more disturbing followed. The Watchers produced offspring known as the Nephilim. Were they giants? Hybrid beings? Something else entirely? Scholars continue debating the details, but the ancient texts agree on one thing. Their existence represented corruption on a massive scale. And the Watchers brought more than offspring. They introduced forbidden knowledge, weaponry, sorcery, manipulation, and powerful arts humanity was not prepared to wield responsibly. Now the flood begins to look different, doesn't it? Most people assume it was simply punishment for human wickedness. But what if it was something else? What if it was an emergency response to a crisis that threatened the entire structure of creation? According to Enoch, humanity was being altered physically, morally, and spiritually. The corruption was spreading beyond repair. The flood was not merely judgment. It was intervention, a desperate attempt to preserve what remained. That idea carries a powerful lesson. When corruption enters your life, the question is rarely whether it exists. The real question is how far it has spread. A toxic habit, a destructive relationship, a damaging belief. At what point does management stop working? At what point is a complete reset required? The most effective people understand that contamination grows when ignored. Delay often makes recovery harder. The Watchers created a situation where delay was no longer possible. And what happened to them? Their punishment was immediate. Enoch describes them being bound in darkness beneath the earth, awaiting final judgment. Sound familiar? It should. 2 Peter and the book of Jude reference angels who abandoned their proper domain and were imprisoned in chains. Michael Heiser argues these passages point directly back to the Watcher rebellion. Different books, same event. A warning preserved across centuries for those willing to connect the dots. But here is the twist most people never hear. The story did not end with the flood. The corruption did not disappear. The Nephilim returned. New enemies emerged, and the conflict between heaven and earth entered an entirely new phase. So ask yourself this: if the Watchers were judged, why does their influence still seem visible throughout history? In Part 5, we uncover the Nephilim, their shocking return, and a divine strategy so precise it unfolds across centuries like a supernatural military campaign. Part 5. Mount Hermon, the Nephilim, and the cosmic crime that changed history. In Part 4, we watch the Watchers descend to Mount Hermon and cross a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. But that was only the beginning. What happened next became one of the most controversial stories in biblical history. Why did ancient writers preserve it so carefully? Why did later authorities seem eager to move past it? And why do traces of this event appear across multiple civilizations? To answer those questions, we must meet the beings born from that rebellion, the Nephilim. Who were the Nephilim really? Were they simply powerful warriors remembered through legend, or something far stranger? Genesis calls them mighty men of renown, but the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and ancient Aramaic traditions add details that change everything. They describe beings who stood between worlds, part human, part something else. And if those texts are even partially correct, then the crisis before the flood was far more serious than most people realize. The name itself offers a clue. Nephilim is linked to a Hebrew root associated with falling, the fallen ones, or perhaps those who cause others to fall. But why would ancient authors focus on them so intensely? Because according to these traditions, their existence represented a corruption of creation's original order. They were not merely large, they were symbolic of a deeper problem. Boundaries collapsing, roles being abandoned, and consequences spreading far beyond the individuals involved. Now here is where Michael Heiser asks a question most readers never consider. Why does the Old Testament repeatedly highlight certain people groups by name? The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. Why preserve those names at all? His answer is provocative. These groups were connected to the same corruption narrative, and if that is true, then many events in Canaan were not random military campaigns. They were part of a much larger spiritual conflict unfolding across generations. That perspective leads to an uncomfortable realization. Not every problem is meant to be tolerated. Not every destructive pattern should be managed indefinitely. Sometimes the real solution is removal. Think about the habits, influences, or beliefs that quietly weaken a person's life year after year. The most effective people often succeed because they identify corruption early and eliminate it at the root. The biblical narrative presents exactly that principle, but on a much larger scale. And then there is Mount Hermon itself. Why did the Watchers choose that mountain? Why not somewhere else? In ancient tradition, Hermon became a symbol of rebellion, a place where a supernatural oath was sworn. But later, something remarkable happened. The same region became connected to God's unfolding plan for restoration. Coincidence? Or was territory itself part of the story? The deeper you look, the more the geography begins to feel intentional rather than accidental. Now bring that idea into your own life. Every person has territory that should belong to them, but has been occupied for years. Maybe it is a fear, a destructive mindset, a family pattern passed from one generation to the next. The lesson of the Promised Land is not that resistance disappears. It is that resistance often marks the very territory worth reclaiming. The giants are there precisely because the ground matters, and reclaiming it becomes part of the assignment. But the mystery deepens after the flood. Genesis says the Nephilim existed before the flood and afterward. How could that be? If the corruption had been removed, why does the story reappear? Heiser points to genealogies, surviving traditions, and recurring references scattered throughout Scripture. Whether one agrees with every conclusion or not, the question refuses to disappear. Something about this narrative continued long after the waters receded, and the biblical writers clearly wanted readers to notice. This brings us to Joshua and Caleb. 12 spies looked at the same land, 12 saw the same giants, yet 10 returned defeated before the battle even began, while 2 remained confident. What changed? Not the enemy, not the terrain. The difference was perspective. 10 focused on the size of the obstacle, 2 focused on the authority behind the mission. The challenge was identical. The interpretation was completely different, and that lesson remains just as relevant today. But now we arrive at the question that launches part 6. If these events belonged only to Israel's story, why do similar accounts appear everywhere? Why do Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek and Mesopotamian traditions all preserve memories of divine beings descending from heaven, interacting with humanity and producing extraordinary offspring? Are they unrelated myths or fragments of a much older memory shared across cultures? In part 6, the ancient world converges and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Part 6. Ancient Near East. When other civilizations remembered the same council. What if the world's oldest myths are not myths at all? What if they are fragments of memory, broken pieces of a much older story scattered across civilizations that never should have agreed on the same details? Ancient Egypt, Babylon, Sumer, Greece, different languages, different cultures, different gods. Yet they all describe divine beings descending from heaven, ruling territories, interacting with humanity, and demanding loyalty. Coincidence? Or evidence that they were all remembering the same ancient reality from different angles? This is where Michael Heiser's argument becomes impossible to ignore. Many scholars claim Israel borrowed ideas from surrounding cultures. Heiser proposes something very different. What if Israel and its neighbors were not copying one another at all? What if they were preserving fragments of the same historical memory? According to this view, the divine council was not invented by Israel. It was remembered by Israel and remembered imperfectly by everyone else. Suddenly, similarities stop looking accidental. To understand this, we have to travel to an ancient city called Ugarit. In 1929, archaeologists uncovered clay tablets there that transformed biblical scholarship overnight. Why? Because the texts described a heavenly assembly ruled by a supreme figure named El. Beneath him sat divine beings known as the Sons of El. They received assignments, governed territories, and participated in cosmic administration. Sound familiar? The resemblance to the biblical divine council is not vague. It is detailed, structured, and remarkably precise. But here is where things become even more interesting. If both traditions speak of El, does that mean Israel copied Canaanite religion? Heiser says no. He argues the opposite. The nations remembered the supreme God imperfectly and gradually shifted their loyalty toward lesser spiritual beings. Israel preserved the original understanding. Suddenly, the first commandment sounds different. It does not deny the existence of other supernatural beings. It establishes who stands above them. The distinction changes everything. Now move east towards Sumer and Babylon. There we encounter another familiar pattern, the Anunnaki, the Igigi, councils of divine beings gathering to discuss humanity's fate. Why do these stories repeatedly describe heavenly assemblies governing earthly affairs? And why do some of them include divine figures producing extraordinary offspring with human beings? The parallels to Genesis 6 are difficult to miss. Different names, different symbols. Yet the underlying structure keeps appearing again and again. Then comes Greece, the civilization most people know best. Zeus, Apollo, Ares, Poseidon, gods ruling distinct domains, gods gathering in council, gods interfering in human affairs, gods producing heroic offspring through unions with mortals, Hercules, Perseus, Achilles. Why does this pattern sound so familiar by now? Because we have seen versions of it before. The names change, the cultures change, but the framework remains strangely consistent. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to dismiss. So what does this convergence actually teach us? Perhaps the most important lesson of all, truth has a habit of surviving, even when it is distorted, even when it is buried, even when entire civilizations rise and fall around it. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the collective unconscious. Joseph Campbell described recurring mythic patterns across cultures. Heiser points to a shared ancient memory, different explanations, same observation. Certain truths keep resurfacing because reality leaves fingerprints that history cannot erase. Now bring that principle into your own life. Have you ever noticed how certain truths refuse to stay buried? A calling you keep ignoring, a purpose you keep postponing, a conviction that returns no matter how many distractions you throw at it. Ancient civilizations preserved memories of the divine council because some ideas are too powerful to disappear completely. In the same way, your deepest truths tend to return until you finally confront them. The question is not whether they will come back. The question is whether you will listen. But there is one final mystery we have not answered. If these civilizations remembered the same divine beings, then their connection to geography becomes impossible to ignore. Why were certain nations linked to specific spiritual powers? Why do ancient texts repeatedly connect territories, borders, and supernatural rulers? Was the division of the nations after Babel simply political, or was it something much larger? To answer that, we must examine one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible. And that brings us directly to part 7, because hidden inside Deuteronomy 32 is a map, a blueprint of how the nations were divided, governed, and ultimately corrupted. It is a passage that changes the way many scholars read world history itself. So before we continue, comment Part 6, Ancient Memory, and tell me which parallel surprised you most, Ugarit, Sumer, Babylon, or Greece. Because in Part 7, the map is revealed, and once you see it, world history may never look the same again. Part 7, Spiritual Geography, How the Nations Were Divided Among Divine Beings. What if the map that explains human history was never printed in any atlas? Not because it was lost, but because most people never knew it existed. We spend our lives studying borders, empires, and wars, yet the unseen realm claims the real map lies beneath them all. A hidden structure shaping nations long before modern governments appeared. Could entire civilizations have been influenced by unseen rulers? According to Michael Heiser, the answer is yes, and the evidence begins in a passage most readers overlook. The key is found in Deuteronomy 32, but not in the version most people know. Why do ancient manuscripts and modern translations sometimes disagree? Because the oldest evidence preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls reveals something extraordinary. It says that when the Most High divided humanity, he assigned the nations according to the number of the sons of God. Think about that. What if the nations of the world were never meant to stand alone? What if every territory was placed under supernatural administration from the very beginning? Now pause and ask yourself a difficult question. If divine beings were assigned to guide the nations, why does history seem filled with oppression, corruption, and darkness? The answer takes us back to Psalm 82. The members of the Divine Council were given authority, but many abandoned their responsibility. Instead of reflecting the justice of the Most High, they demanded loyalty for themselves. The result? Entire civilizations slowly drifted away from truth. Suddenly, history stops looking random and starts looking tragically consistent. Here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Among all the nations assigned to divine rulers, one nation was different. Why was Israel treated separately? Why does the biblical narrative focus so intensely on a single people? The text gives a remarkable answer. God assigned the nations to the sons of God, but he kept Israel for himself. No intermediary, no delegated ruler, direct relationship. That single distinction explains why Israel occupies such a unique place throughout the biblical story. But before dismissing this as ancient theology, consider the practical lesson hidden inside it. Every system has layers of authority. Families, companies, governments, even communities operate through intermediaries. Yet the healthiest systems maintain a direct connection to their highest source of purpose. What happens when that connection is lost? Confusion grows, corruption spreads, priorities become distorted. The principle behind Israel's story is surprisingly modern. Never lose sight of the authority above the authorities. The pattern becomes even clearer when we examine Genesis 10. Most readers see a genealogy. Heiser sees something more. Why does the chapter carefully list 70 nations? Ancient Jewish tradition connected those 70 nations with 70 divine rulers. Coincidence? The biblical authors did not think so. They saw structure, design, intentional governance, 70 nations, 70 assigned authorities, one supreme ruler above them all. The world was not imagined as chaotic. It was understood as organized, even when that organization became corrupted. Now look at history through this lens. Why do some regions seem trapped in recurring cycles of violence, corruption, and instability despite countless reforms? Political explanations matter, but are they the whole story? The divine council worldview suggests a deeper layer. Corrupt spiritual rulers influence corrupt cultural systems. Bad ideas become traditions. Destructive patterns become normal. Entire generations inherit the consequences. Whether you accept the framework or not, it offers a striking explanation for why some problems survive long after human solutions have failed. The most effective reformers in history seem to understand this instinctively. They fought visible problems, but they also challenged the invisible beliefs beneath them. William Wilberforce did not see slavery as merely an economic issue. Martin Luther King Jr. did not see segregation as merely a legal issue. Both recognized deeper forces shaping human behavior. Why does this matter? Because lasting transformation rarely begins at the surface. Real change starts when the governing ideas behind a system are confronted directly. So here is your challenge. Think about one broken system in your own life. It could be a workplace, a relationship pattern, or even a belief you inherited years ago. Then ask a different question. Not just what is wrong, but what invisible principle has been ruling this territory. Every system serves something. Every pattern follows a governing idea. Once you identify the root authority behind a problem, solutions become clearer. And now we arrive at the question that leads directly into part 8. If the nations were divided among divine beings, and many of those beings became corrupt, was there one figure whose role was different from all the rest? Not a territorial ruler, not a watcher assigned to a nation, but a being with access to the divine council itself. A figure whose purpose was to challenge, accuse, and oppose. Most people think they already know his story. According to Heiser, they don't. And what comes next changes everything. Part 8. Satan's real role, the prosecutor who became the enemy. What if the biggest misunderstanding in modern religion is not about heaven, hell, or angels, but about Satan himself? For centuries, people have imagined a cosmic villain locked in eternal war against God. But what if the earliest biblical texts describe